Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to that second flip that I'm now recording for the second time. All right, but we're not going to talk about it, right? We're going to move past it. We're going to woosah. We're going to take a deep breath, and it's going to be fine. And I'm going to try to replicate the flip that I made the last time before I forgot to hit record and just ended up talking to myself in my room by myself, alone and sad. Crying. Now, anyway, so the big thing about it in general is we left off in class talking more about the Mesopotamians, right? So the big thing we were focusing on in class is like the specific, well, we talked about ziggurats in the Tower of Babel, and I was really impressed because Audrey was like, Tower of Babel, blah, blah, blah. And right, so I was very, very impressed. Audrey, very good stuff. Now, the biggest thing in general, though, when we're really, really looking at all this stuff, is that we started really like kind of delving into like the ziggurats, the architecture. We reviewed a lot of the Epic of Gilgamesh, talked about his big naked friend Enkidu and like all that stuff. We talked about like a lot of those different things and really went over a lot of that nitpicky stuff. And then we dove headfirst into what each individual city-state in Mesopotamian areas actually gave to the totality that is Mesopotamian culture, right? I know Elena during the warm-up was just like, oh yeah, it's a bunch of city-states and stuff like that. Yeah, it's very key that we remember that, right? It's very key that we remember the concept that this entire civilization is comprised of all these different city-states that are spread out over that really big Fertile Crescent area, right? In between the Tigris and the Euphrates area, or Euphrates rivers, because remember, it's literally what Mesopotamia means, between two rivers, right? So we got into the Sumerians, we got into the Akkadians, we talked about the postal service with their little clay envelope.
Mail time.
Mail time. Mail time. Mail time.
The mail's here.
Here's the mail, it never fails. It makes me want to wag my tail. When it comes, I want to wail.
Right? Like, so we talked about all that cool stuff, and then we stopped or left off on the Babylonians, right? Now, the Babylonians are most famous for being led by this guy named King Hammurabi, right? And some of y'all have probably heard of King Hammurabi before. King Hammurabi is probably the most famous Mesopotamian leader next to Nebuchadnezzar, right? Now, King Hammurabi, very, very intense figure because he is going to lead the Babylonian army in the image of Sargon the Great's Akkadian army and have a very, very large military structure that takes over most of the city-states within Mesopotamia, and he creates a synthesis effect of a lot of different things coming from the different Mesopotamian regions. He improves canals, he improves dikes, he improves the irrigation systems, he establishes a booming economy based mainly on grains, right? And then also, he compiled the largest known at the time and very, very first collective code of law, right? King Hammurabi's code of law, or Hammurabi's code as it's known, is a law system that is based on one particular premise, right? An eye for an eye, right? And I'm sure that we have heard about an eye for an eye because yet again, in the Old Testament of the Bible, it says an eye for an eye will leave the whole world blind, is alluding to this entire concept, right? Mesopotamian law, particularly that of like Babylon, actually really focused heavily on this concept of an eye for an eye, right? For example, one of the most famous lines or famous codes of law from this Mesopotamian code of law literally says, if a man strike out the eye of a wealthy man, then his eye shall be taken away from him. It's this really crazy thing where it's like, oh, if you hurt my eye, I get to hurt your eye. Or if we're sitting in class and like Lindsay like gets into a fight with Olivia and they just start punching each other in the face or whatever, and like Lindsay breaks like Olivia's arm, Olivia now gets to break Lindsay's arm, right? It's a very big code that is established based on like doing back to the violator what has been done to the other person, right? There's ones that include, like, if a man strikes a woman who is with child and she has a miscarriage, and he is a regular man and she is a wealthy man, then his daughter will be killed, and, like, all this other crazy stuff, right? And this eye for an eye premise in this Hammurabi's Code of Law is based on the idea of what Hammurabi was going for. He took all of the different laws from the places he took over and compiled them into one singular text. And it's got over 282 different laws on it, all kept on this really, really large black stone tablet column where everyone could come up and look at it. It's got like 14,000 lines of cuneiform or something crazy like that. It's some ridiculously high number. And the entire tablet is extremely tall. Let's look that up real quick, actually. I want to know how like tall this tablet is. How tall is Hammurabi's Code? Yeah, it's 7 feet 4.5 inches. So like this thing that it sits on is 7 feet tall, 4.5 inches, and below this headpiece are all the lines of cuneiform. You can actually see a little bit of it starting right there, right? And it's got tons and tons of lines of like cuneiform written on there that describe all the laws. It also has a prologue that's like written in a poetic style and stuff like that. But the point of Hammurabi's code was that all the punishments were supposed to fit the crime, right? Every single punishment that someone had done onto them, it was supposed to fit the crime of which they had done, right? But the question is, was it always fair, right? Remember we talked about like Neolithic, Paleolithic, the transfer of Paleolithic into Neolithic with the invention of farming and a bunch of its negative outcomes? Well, one of those biggest negative outcomes was this establishment of social classes, right? This concept that there's going to be like wealthier people and poorer people and all these other things. Well, the thing about it is Hammurabi's code kind of demonstrates why that is a negative in society, right? Due to the fact that basically what's going on, wow, I'm having like another random thought out of nowhere. Sorry about that. All right, so basically what's going on is if you were super wealthy in Mesopotamia and you hurt or injured a poorer person, it wasn't eye for an eye. It was pay your way out of this, right? You could even see it as well in like family dynamics, that the eye for an eye concept didn't just apply to everybody, right? So for example, if we were to, like if I was a wealthy person and I got hit in the face by a poor person, I could hit the poor person back in the face, right? But if I'm the wealthy person and I hit the poor person, then I can just like pay them $1 and then like it like kind of move on with my day, right? Same thing you can see it as well, is that like in Mesopotamia under Hammurabi's code, if a son hits his dad, they cut the son's hand off, right? Which is way past eye for an eye, if you ask me. I'm just throwing that out there. And then there's all these other crazy ones about like, but what we're getting at is just like the differences between the social classes were heavily evident in this Babylonian text, right? And then later on you have the Assyrians, right? So the Babylonians are going to fall and they're going to be taken over by the Assyrians. And the Assyrians are an aggressive warrior culture that we'll talk about later, right? We'll actually come back to them. And then the Neo-Babylonians are actually going to then kick out the Assyrians again. And they're going to be led by this guy named Nebuchadnezzar, right? So after the Assyrians managed to like make everyone super mad, a new force of Babylonians pop up and they take over and they're led by Nebuchadnezzar, right? And Nebuchadnezzar is very, very famous for making this wonder of the world known as the Hanging Gardens, right? Which if you remind me in class, I'll tell you the story behind the Hanging Gardens and stuff like that. It will ruin all of your ability to like take a man seriously for the rest of your life because this man literally moved the world for the woman that he loved, right? But Nebuchadnezzar is emblematic of a very important thing when we're talking about Mesopotamians. He's emblematic of the concept of warlords taking over different Mesopotamian city-states, right? Mesopotamian leaders in like kind of like large leading groups would always be established by men that controlled large armies, right? We talked about that a little bit in class too. We talked about how Sargon the Great controlled the first large army. Then we got Hammurabi, controls a large army. Nebuchadnezzar controls a large army. The Assyrians, led by a large army, right? Like, so like the thing about it though in general is that it's going to become a very, very war-torn area that's going to be a very prominent part of their culture going forward, right? So looking at it though, now we're about to shift gears completely and we're going to head on over to someplace else. And we're going to start talking about the second ancient civilization, chronologically speaking. They were established about, like, give or take, about 800 years formally after the Mesopotamians. And they're going to be established a pretty good ways away, but they are going to end up trading with the Mesopotamians later on. And a lot of their ideas are going to diffuse together and exchange and stuff like that. But what I'm getting at is we're now talking about the ancient Egyptians, right? We're getting into the ancient Egyptians that I find absolutely fascinating, right? I find the ancient Egyptians so interesting. I think the concepts of their religion and their culture and their artwork and their lifestyles and their clothing and their historiography, like their stories, they're all so good, right? Like, I don't know if any of y'all had the chance to actually go see in Noma this summer, at Noma, at the New Orleans Museum of Art, there was a Nefertari exhibit, and they had a bunch of ancient Egyptian artifacts there. It was so freaking cool. But the thing about it is, though, is that ancient Egypt gets a little bit of a bad rap, because 9 times out of 10, anytime anybody thinks of ancient Egypt, they think of this guy, right? That is, of course, the very, very famous King Tut, right? King Tutankhamun. Everybody thinks like, oh, that's where King Tut's from, and it's all the mummies and stuff. There's a lot more to them than just King Tut and mummies, right? And Tut, man, you seen better days, big fella. Like, ugh, God, you look like a piece of beef jerky. All right, so now the big thing about it, though, in general, is there are a lot of stories about it. And King Tut actually comes from way later in their history. He's actually a new kingdom pharaoh, a part of the 18th dynasty, right? And we'll talk about all that stuff during this part of the entire unit when we get into our kind of more nitty-gritty analysis of the ancient Egyptians and stuff like that. But let's start off by talking about the ancient Egyptians in the way that you're supposed to start off talking about every ancient civilization. You immediately go to your map, right? You need to know where this is. Maps are so important. So everybody do me a favor, get out your map.
If there's a place you gotta go, I'm the one you need to know. I'm the map. I'm the map. I'm the map. If there's a place you gotta get, I can get you there, I bet. I'm the map. 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 I'm the map.
Very nice. All right, so yeah, exactly, right? See, you got to have your map around, right? So now the big thing about it is, do any of you know, I think you might, because we actually talked about this a little bit the other day in class during a warm-up, that this is going to be the Mediterranean Sea up here in the north, and this is North Africa, and Italy's over there, like right about there, Greece is right about over here, and then the Middle East starts right here. Do any of you know, on this map, where is Egypt? Okay, we talked about a couple. One, I think it was Yanez, knew that this was Morocco right here. I think somebody knew it was Algeria. So I think somebody called it Albania at one point. I can't remember what that was. Libya is right there. Where is Egypt? Very good job, Layla. That is exactly right. That is right, Egypt, right there, okay? Egypt is this one right up here in the northern corner of Africa, right? So Egypt is going to have, because it's located in the northern corner of Africa, is going to have a very important geography that's going to drastically affect the growth of its culture, right? So being located in northern Africa, as we already know, it's going to be super hot, right? Like, so it's going to be very, very hot and very, very arid, all right? They are actually bordering also the Sahelian zone of Africa, which is referring to the Sahara, right? By the way, for the rest of your life, it's the Sahara, all right? It's not Sahara Desert because the word Sahara means desert, so every time you say Sahara Desert, you're just saying desert, all right? So like now, the Sahelian region or the Sahara Desert, or crap, see what you did to me? You see what you did to me? Now look, so the Sahara region of North Africa, starting right about here, cutting through most of Egypt and things like that, is extremely hot and arid. The soil has very little to no minerals inside of it. The average temperature in the summer can break 100, and the average temperature at night during the cooler seasons can drop down to close to freezing, right? So it's a very chaotic and climactic area, right? It's another one of these places where it's like, why would you settle there? Well, a lot of it has to do with the river that cuts through their area. We've got the Tigris and the Euphrates over in Mesopotamia. We have the Nile in northern Africa, right? The Nile River, the longest river in the world, and the only major river in the world that flows from south to north, right? Which is a very important little factor about this, right? Now, the Nile River is going to be very important to the to the Egyptians. It's so important, in fact, it's going to drastically change the way that these cultures view their river. So this earliest part of analyzing ancient Egypt is going to really get us into some nitty-gritty stuff about the differences between them and the Mesopotamians, right? So looking forward and ahead on that, you have to understand that the Egyptians viewed the Nile as their key to life, right? They were like, we don't fear our river. Mesopotamians lived in fear of their river, right? Remember, Humbaba speaks and a flood happens, right? And Gilgamesh has to go off and fight him to save or stop that natural disaster. The Egyptians were like, no, we need our river to flood. It must flood every year. And we'll get into why that is here in a second, but just take a second to look at the Nile and the green thrush of life that it causes around its banks and along its borders, right? This right here, of course you would settle next to this if you're the ancient Egyptians, right? And their big, large key cities were all lying in the Nile. Karnak, Cairo, and the other one, their capital at the time, was not Cairo. A lot of people think it's Cairo, but it's not. So the capital of ancient Egypt was actually Memphis, and it was located in the northern sector of the Nile, right? Now, the thing about it, though, in general, is this also is the Delta region that we need to kind of just, remember that off the top of our head because it's where it, dumps into the Mediterranean Sea. And any of you know or ever heard of the very famous city known as Alexandria, it's going to be Oh, excuse me, that's not Alexandria right there. Excuse me, sorry about that. That is Alexandria, located right over here. It's going to become a prominent city later on when we start talking about people like Cleopatra and the Romans and Julius Caesar and Augustus, because they actually interacted with each other. A lot of people were like, the Egyptians were really old and then they died and never ever talked about them again. No, the Egyptians fought against the Romans, right? Like, I mean, they were around for thousands and thousands and thousands of years and extremely intelligent. And were considered the breadbasket of, like, the entire Mediterranean. Like, everybody, like, wanted their grains and their breads and stuff like that. So, like, now the big thing about it in general, though, is speaking of, like, the breadbasket and all this other stuff, ancient Egyptians depended on the Nile in a really, really big way. And a lot of it has to do with the seasonal flooding that would actually happen to the Nile, right? So every single September, the Nile floods, right? It breaks its banks, and all this water floods all over to the banks, right? And some of you are probably thinking to yourself, you're like, Mr. Terry, why would this be good? This sounds terrible. Why would anybody want to live next to a place where it's going to flood regularly all the time? Well, we all live like close to New Orleans and in southern Louisiana, so we understand this whole concept of flooding. It's just like something we deal with. But in Egypt, they needed it to do this. They needed it to flood so they could survive. Reason being is because every single year around September, when the waters would begin to rise, the water would be coming through the higher elevations, of course, at the southern end of the Nile, churning up the bottom of the riverbed, right? Getting all this sediment, like really, really stirred up inside of the river. And for y'all to understand how this is, living in this area, you've seen the Mississippi after a huge rainstorm, right? It's crazy high and it's really, really muddy, right? So the big thing about it is that mud, the reason why it's so dark, that's the liquid gold that the Egyptians needed. Because when it would actually flood and break the banks, that mud would be deposited all over the soil. And then whenever the waters would retreat in November, what would be left behind is this stuff called silt. That mud that gets churned up off the bottom of the river is known as silt, right? S-I-L-T, not silk, that's a fabric. All right, so now, silt, on the other hand, is a sediment that is full of nutrients and all of these different fertilizers and good stuff that the Egyptians needed so they could plant on this actual land and not strip all the nutrients out of the soil, right? So the big thing about it in general is that silt is made of this precious stuff. How many of y'all have ever actually been swimming in a river before? If you've ever swam in a river before in your entire life, you probably know what I'm talking about, because every kid has reached down, if you've swam in a river, into the bottom and picked up the mud and stuff like that and tried to bring it over the water, and every single time that it gets close to the water surface, it goes whoosh, and it just kind of goes immediately through your hands, right? Well, that is the silt, right? It's made of dead, rotting like animals and leaves and decomposed matter, so it's just full of good nutrients. And so when that gets left behind, the soil is ready to go. But the question is this going to make it easier or harder for Egyptians to farm? Answer is way easier, right? This stuff right here, that silt, makes it so fertile in Egypt that you can just stick a seed in the dirt and it just goes whack, and it just is going to grow. I don't know if it's going to make that noise go whack, but it's just going to grow really, really quickly, right? Almost anything you put into the soil in ancient Egypt, it's going to grow, and it's going to grow fast, all right? So, now, the big thing in general is this is going to really affect everyone's perception of ancient Egypt, because even other Greek historians and Roman historians are going to look at it and be like, man, Egypt is the gift of the Nile. And that is what right there, this dark sedimentary silt and all this different stuff, is what mineral-rich soil looks like. And if you don't have stuff like this to reinvigorate your soil every single year, then you end up with dirt like this. This is a picture taken from North Carolina, and very close to where I live. As you can tell, all of the good nutrients have been leached out of the soil because of the amount of cotton farming that happened there over hundreds and hundreds of years, right? And look at all, that's just clay left behind, and everything good has been sucked out of it, right? So the silt made it so literally they could plant so easily every single year. Now, with that, though, you have to understand as well, we're now going to start really looking at, okay, so that's how they planted, that's their agriculture, that's why they settled there, right? That's their geography. Now we're going to start looking at their culture, right? So we're kind of getting on the off-ramp, and we're going straight towards their culture. Now, their government is also going to be very emblematic of their culture as well, because we're setting up one of the earliest differences between ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia. And the earliest difference has to do with the fact that Egypt is very different from Mesopotamia in the way that it was set up. As we already know, like I said, Elena during the warm-up pointed out that actually Mesopotamia is a region of a bunch of different city-states that would all rise and fall in power, right? That is 100% true. Egypt, not like that at all. Egypt was actually it started out as two kingdoms that would unite together and make one massive area that had one uniform culture, one uniform language, one uniform writing style, one uniform religion, one uniform everything, right? They were what is known as a centralized kingdom, right? They were ruled from one location, a capital city, and they had a bureaucracy that sent everything out and made it ruling over that entire region very effective, right? So Egypt was one giant kingdom that spanned the Nile. Now, it did start out as two, right? There was an upper Egypt and a lower Egypt, right? And in the upper and lower regions, things were done a little bit differently at first. But in 3100 BC, the very first pharaoh comes along and unites them together. And we'll get into pharaohs and stuff like that, but a pharaoh is a king of ancient Egypt, right? And so they are very, very important, but you can actually see the unification in the crown that an ancient Egyptian pharaoh would wear. And the very first pharaoh to actually wear said crown was this guy right here, Menes, who was going to unite the two kingdoms together, and you could see it in the actual crowns that ancient Egyptian pharaohs would wear, right? This one right here, the white crown, was the crown of Lower Egypt. And then the red crown right here, the one that looks like it has a lizard hiding inside of it because it's it's actually the crown of Upper Egypt. And when Menes united the two kingdoms together, he unified the crowns as well, creating this thing right here that is just a direct representation of the unification of the two kingdoms and the creation of a uniform Egyptian culture. Now, this, on the other hand, is what Mesopotamia looks like. That is very different from ancient Egypt. Look at all the city-states spread out all over the place, right? Now, as we're getting into it, though, as well, the pharaohs also had a very particular form of rulership, right? They ruled using this thing known as dynastic rule, right? So dynastic rule is going to be a form of rulership in which the pharaohs figure out how they're going to keep picking new pharaohs after each one of them dies, right? Well, the way they're going to do this is through dynasties, okay? And dynastic rule is when communion service in the chapel. All right, so dynastic rule is going to be where a series of families take turns, well, not take turns, but they rule for a period of time until they die out and then another one takes over, right? So the way, a lot of y'all could look at this is kind of a lot like monarchs of Europe. You could consider that a dynastic rulership, right? The Bourbons in France, which is why Bourbon Street is named Bourbon Street, the Tudors over in England, the Habsburgs of Austria, the Hohenzollerns of Germany, the Romanovs of Russia. That concept had existed thousands of years before the Europeans ever did it. And the very first ones to do it were the ancient Egyptians, right? They did their dynastic rulership system in a little bit of a different way, though, than the Europeans did later on. Europeans used family last names. On the other hand, dynastic rulership in Egypt was done using numbers, right? So literally there were 23 different dynasties. I'm pretty confident that actually is correct. It's either 23 or 30 or something like that. There's a 3 in there, I know that. Hey Siri, how many dynasties were there in ancient Egypt?
Here's what I found from Ducksters.com.
Oh, it says over 30. I don't know. I've always heard there's 23. But anyway, I know the most successful one was the 18th. Meh. Now, the biggest one in general, though, is this dynastic ruling familyship is very keenly different from Mesopotamia because, remember, they were led by warlords and people that just led large armies. Now, also getting into it as well, we are going to kind of start talking about their religion and their mythology and stuff like that, right? So getting into how their religion is distinctly different from the Mesopotamian one because the Mesopotamians had 3,600 gods. The reason why they had 3,600 gods, a lot of that has to do with the fact because literally there were so many different city-states and every single city-state had different gods that they liked or didn't like or whatever. And so as things grow, early on in ancient Egypt, even all the way up until the New Kingdom period, when I say early on, I actually mean for most of the civilization, they had 2 supreme gods. They had Amun, who was the wise god king of the sky, and then there was actually the Ra, who was this justified taker of life and the god of the sun, who rode around the skies in a flaming boat, which is very keenly important and connected to their geography because, of course, he's in a boat and he's not in a chariot because he's not Greek and they have the Nile and they ride a lot of boats. Now, getting into it, though, as well, so he also had other deities as well, like Horus, who is the messenger of the gods, who would actually bring down ruling power upon the actual pharaohs, and he was represented by a falcon's head, right? Which is a very, very cool thing. And I love the integration of desert animals and desert-dwelling animals into the actual mythology of all of the ancient Egyptians, because to them, they're who would be a messenger of the gods? Oh, a falcon, like the falcons that actually live near us. Oh, Horus, falcon head. I love this entire concept, right? So now looking at it as well, as time progressed and getting up into the New Kingdom period, they are actually going to combine Amun and Ra into one supreme god known as Amun-Ra. But they're still polytheistic, right? Still polytheistic because they still have multiple gods and stuff like that. But it's interesting in the element of understanding Egyptian polytheism, and then also seeing early Christianity / Old Testament Judaism, right? Because you can actually see some similar symbols between the ancient religion of Egypt and the old religion of the Jews as well, right? And what I mean by that is this Amun-Ra, like this merging of like Amun and Ra together to create an absolutely formless God who is completely omniscient and sees everything with his all-seeing eye at all given times and can embody himself into anything he wants at any given time is very similar to the concepts laid out in some of the Talmud and also the Tanakh and some of the earliest Judaic scrolls, right? He's formless, he embodies himself at anything, anytime. Every time he comes down in the form of Horus, it was always believed to be represented by the sun that was actually above Horus's head. So like the really interesting thing as well is like looking at it is also the forms that he would actually come down as, right? A very, very prominent form that Ra would sometimes return to earth as is like a very large ram, right? A very big ram and stuff like that. And then also, of course, when we look at the Old Testament of the Bible, whenever Abraham was told not to sacrifice Isaac, what was he given? A ram that was standing in front of the sun, which is just a very interesting little correlation between these different like symbols and this like actual like religious like crossover and stuff like that, right? But the big thing about it though is this is huge, and then we'll talk about their religion, resurrection, and all that stuff when I see y'all in class next time I see you, okay? But y'all have a fantastic weekend. Enjoy yourself, and I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.